Sunday, 4th of October, 1936. East End of London. The streets echo with the sounds of cheers and singing from around 100,000 voices as they celebrate a victory. This coming together of people in equality and solidarity proved far more than what their government had so far seemed incapable of doing, standing up to the devil of fascism. Today, Descent into Darkness explores the origins of the fight for the very soul of Britain itself in Good versus Evil, the Battle of Cable Street. Background. Whilst it is rarely reported on today, Britain's Jewish population has not always enjoyed the friendliest of welcomes. Those of you familiar with the case of Jack the Ripper in 1888 will know of the rampant anti-Semitism that existed at the time, but it goes back far further than that. In 1190, there had been a wholesale massacre of the Jews of the city of York, who had taken refuge from an angry mob in Clifford's Tower. Those of you who remember your scripture will know that Jesus had something of a problem with moneylenders. Thus, it was strictly forbidden for Christians to lend money and charge interest. However, no such religious restrictions existed for Jews. This meant that a lot of English people, even the king himself, were in debt to Jewish moneylenders. One local minor York noble, Richard Malabis, was so heavily in the red that he decided in desperation to simply rid himself of his debtor. This is what had led to the event at Clifford's Tower. Despite being offered safe passage if they chose to convert to Christianity, around 150 people were slaughtered, and the records of their monies owed all burned. When King Richard I found out about this, he flew into a fit of rage, levying a hefty fine against the entire city of York, and Richard Malabis was stripped of his lands and assets and was excommunicated from the church. To prevent the same thing happening again, the king ordered the creation of an official ledger of debts that would be held and maintained by the medieval version of the government. So you better cancel your unannounced nighttime visit to your bank manager's house. It really doesn't work like that anymore. As alluded to before, there had been a massive influx of Jews from Eastern Europe due to the Tsarist pogroms in the Russian Empire in the late 19th century. A lot of these refugees had ended up in the East End of London, an already overpopulated, poor and squalid area of the city. This influx had led to an extreme distrust amongst other Londoners. These people spoke a wide array of languages, from Russian, Polish, Yiddish, and more, and they kept themselves to themselves. When the Whitechapel murders had begun in the autumn of 1888, there had been a strong feeling that the perpetrator was a Jew, as no Englishman could possibly stoop to such depravity. This blatant racism had led to mobs attempting to lynch suspects without a single shred of evidence other than hearsay, the most notable being that of cobbler John Pizer, known to the community as Leather Apron. Rumours had it that he threatened prostitutes with a knife, and with the entirely inconsequential discovery of a leather apron hung up in the garden where the body of Annie Chapman was found on the morning of the 8th of September 1888, was enough to stir up vigilantes to go hunting for Mr. Pizer, who had to be whisked away under police escort for his own safety. 30 years later, and with the rise of communist Russia, came the deeply anti-Semitic feelings in Germany that had caused many ordinary people and former soldiers to blame Jews for stabbing Germany in the back, leading to their defeat at the hands of the Allies. With Karl Marx being Jewish himself, communism was seen as a Jewish-manufactured conspiracy to undermine the ancient establishments of Europe. These ideas, of course, were taken up in earnest by a young Austrian ex-soldier, Adolf Hitler. His rapid rise to co-option and leadership of the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeitspartei would give him the platform he needed to denounce both communism and, by extension, the Jews. Despite the party having the word socialist in their title, Nazism would become very far removed from socialism, despite what several moronic revisionist commenters will try to argue. But before the rise of Hitler to power, the first fascists come to the fore in Italy as early as the First World War. These early fascists had advocated for Italian participation in the war on the side of the Western Allies, in something of a 180 compared to what would come later. The British Hitler. The antagonist of today's story takes the form of the very dashing and charismatic minor royal Sir Oswald Mosley. Now, already I know you'll have clocked that sus as fuck mustache and instantly get a Hitler vibe, but he would become the bad guy as something of a last resort rather than from the outset like everyone's favourite single-gonaded Austrian punching bag. Oswald Ernald Mosley, born on the 16th of November 1896 in the exceedingly affluent Mayfair district of London. Very out of the ordinary for such a high-born gentleman, he did not attend university, instead joining the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in January of 1914. This establishment even today is the Officer Training College, the direct equivalent of West Point in the USA. Mosley was kicked out of Sandhurst the following June, due to a violent altercation with another student, or, as the college themselves cited it, a riotous act of retaliation. He did, however, serve with the 16th Lancers on the Western Front in the First World War, but with the horse-mounted cavalry becoming very quickly rendered obsolete by trench warfare and machine guns, he transferred to the new cavalry of the sky, the Royal Flying Corps, later the RAF, as an observer, helping to pick out and mark enemy positions. Then, in true foppish aristocratic fashion, he sustained a severe leg injury when he crashed his plane, attempting to show off in front of his family. Rather inadvisably, he returned to the trenches in 1915 during the Battle of Loos, before his injury had fully healed, and he was still suffering from a great deal of pain. So much so, in fact, that one night he actually passed out from it whilst on watch. Following this, he managed to bag a cushy desk job with the Ministry of Munitions and later the Foreign Office. After the war, the 21-year-old Mosley's time working for the civil service had given him a fervent passion for politics. He decided to join the Conservative Party and, playing on his war service, ran for office as MP in the London borough of Harrow. In the 1918 election, he won handily, mostly due to the lack of any serious opposition. He became the youngest MP at the time to actually take his seat in the House of Commons. He spoke fervently about his wishes to avoid another war on the scale of the one that had just gone, but the 1920s were years of great strife at home in the British Isles. Mosley became very vocal in his opposition to the brutal tactics of the so-called Black and Tans, a quasi-police force recruited from ex-soldiers as an auxiliary force of the Royal Irish Constabulary. These men were infamous for their brutal tactics in countering Irish independence activities. This is most definitely a topic for a future video. In the meantime, I suggest you listen to the famous rebel song, Come Out Ye Black and Tans, made famous by the band The Wolf Tones, link in the description. The disquiet around Irish events led to Mosley leaving the Tory party and sat as an independent for the 1922 and 1923 snap election. But in 1924, Mosley was becoming more and more drawn towards the fledgling Labour Party, and so decided to complete his crossing of the floor by joining them under the leadership of James Ramsay MacDonald. Whilst switching sides is rare in British politics, it is not without precedent. Two of the greatest ever Prime Ministers have done so in the past in the forms of Gladstone and Disraeli. Winston Churchill also did so in 1904, and, in the modern day, the exceedingly awful Liz Truss, although she was outlasted by a lettuce. However, MacDonald's minority government fell in the October of 1924, and so Mosley thought it was best to change constituency, as he felt the fairly upper-class bourgeois Harrow would not have accepted him as a Labour candidate. He decided instead to run against former Conservative colleague and future Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain for the seat of Birmingham Ladywood. Mosley campaigned his arse off to try and secure the seat, but his cool charisma and nonchalant charm came with a loose mouth. He deeply insulted Chamberlain, calling him a landlord's hireling, which, by 1920 standards, is quite a sick burn. An outraged Chamberlain called for Mosley to do the gentlemanly thing and publicly retract the statement, but he refused to do so. One of his contemporaries, Liberal MP Leslie Hoare-Belisha, described Mosley as dark, aquiline, flashing, tall, thin, assured, defiance in his eye, contempt in his forward chin. You would think that such a place as Birmingham would reject both candidates being of the well-to-do set, but it was a very close-run thing. There had to be several recounts, to be sure, but Chamberlain just scraped over the line by the skin of his teeth, with only 77 votes more. Mosley shrugged off the defeat, blaming the result on bad weather. Poor effort. I mean, you could have at least done a Giorgio Tsoukalos and blamed it on aliens. During his time away from the House of Commons, Mosley was not idle. He worked away in the background to help develop the Labour Party's economic policies, which became known as the Birmingham Proposals, and would remain a firm constant in Mosley's beliefs right through to the end of his political career. In 1926, he was able to secure a seat back in the Commons with the Labour-held seat of Smethwick became vacant, and a by-election held. He and his first wife, Lady Cynthia Curzon, were members of the socialist think tank the Fabian Society, and appeared in the Society's official list of names in their annual report of 1929 and 30. In 1929, Labour won another election, and Ramsay MacDonald was once again PM. However, despite Mosley's courting of MacDonald's favour, he was only appointed as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Whilst this is considered a high position in politics, at that time it did not come with a seat on the PM's cabinet, but does deal with most of the lands owned by the Crown. Mosley was, however, tasked with coming up with solutions to the then chronic unemployment problems in Britain, but he grew ever more frustrated when his proposals were considered far too extreme and were vetoed by the cabinet. The decline of British domestic industry was cause for concern to Mosley, who, in response, penned a memorandum that called for stiff tariffs to be levied on imports to help protect British-made products, state nationalisation of heavy industries, and to turn the British Empire into a single market trading bloc. A hugely radical proposal that garnered support from famous philosopher and economist John Maynard Keynes, who wrote of Mosley's ideas. I like the spirit which informs the document. A scheme of national economic planning to achieve a right, or at least a better, balance of our industries between the old and the new, between agriculture and manufacture, between home development and foreign investment, and wide executive powers to carry out the details of such a scheme. This is what it amounts to. The manifesto offers us a starting point for thought and action. It will shock. It must do so. The many good citizens of this country who have laissez-faire in their craniums, their consciences, and their bones, but how anyone professing and calling himself a socialist can keep away from the manifesto is a more obscure matter. But despite this glowing endorsement, the party once again blocked the proposals, causing Mosley to spit his dummy out and resign, along with 6 other Labour colleagues. Mosley instead decided to form a new party,
with blackjack and hookers,
which he rather unimaginatively dubbed the New Party. But despite the party gaining solid support from, amongst all people, Aneurin Bevan and Harold Macmillan in the following general election of 1931, they failed to secure a single seat. Mosley once again took his ball and stormed off in a huff, abandoning the new party, that then collapsed overnight. This was the point where the exceedingly disillusioned Mosley began to turn toward the more extreme ideology of fascism. This had come about after he decided to go on something of a study tour of Italy and had become enthralled with Benito Mussolini's regime, which had come to power in 1922. Fascism did exist in Britain, although highly fragmented, which led Mosley wanting to unite all of these small cells into a much larger conglomerate, which stood on a platform of fervent nationalism, authoritarianism, and a rabid anti-communism. And so, in 1932, he formed another new party called the British Union of Fascists, or BUF for short. Yet, despite this, many of the fractured smaller groups of fascists chose not to join the BUF, and some were known to violently oppose Mosley's men. This new body took on many of the symbolisms of the German offshoot of fascism that we now call Nazism, most notably the heavily stylized lightning bolt on a red field of their flag, conjuring up very obvious SS vibes. It should come as a shock to precisely no one from the modern era that the BUF was heavily backed by the newspaper, the Daily Mail. Mosley gave regular speeches at BUF rallies that denounced communism, which, at first, due to the party ideology being modelled on Italian fascism, did not go all in on anti-Semitism. Indeed, from what I have seen, Mosley seems to have been very careful in the words he chose. Although, with Mosley being very good friends with Hitler, I find it hard to believe that anti-Semitism was not part of their mantra. BUF rallies were prone to interruption by counter-protesters, which led to a group of enforcers being formed from those who were more liberal in their use of violence. These men acted as stewards and enforcers for the rallies, keeping order and dealing with any attempted disruption from outside influences. This group became known as the Fascist Defense Force, modelled on the Italian voluntary militia for national security, and were conspicuous by their uniform of a black turtleneck sweater, which gained the group their now infamous nickname of the Black Shirts. On the 7th of June 1934, a foreshadowing of what was to come occurred when, during a rally in Olympia, London, the Black Shirts violently clashed with protesters, leading to bad publicity for the party. But still, Mosley doggedly continued with the expansion of the party's influence and ideals. The BUF were not able to fight the general election of 1935, but they remained resolute and were determined to fight the next election in as many seats as possible. The rallying call. In October of 1936, the BUF planned an official march through the densely Jewish populated area of Whitechapel in London's East End. The main route of this procession was to pass along the 1.2-mile-long thoroughfare of Cable Street, so called for its historical links to the ropery trade that links the areas of Tower Hill and Limehouse. The march was planned to begin at Tower Hill and then split into 4 columns that would make their way to one of 4 rallies that would each be addressed by Mosley himself. These would be at Salmon Lane, Limehouse, at 1700, Stafford Row in Bow at 1800, Victoria Park Square in Bethnal Green, also at 1800, and the last one being at Ask Street in Shoreditch at 1830. A petition was organised by the Jewish People's Council to ban this march, and it garnered in excess of 100,000 signatures in only 2 days, a truly phenomenal number. However, the then Home Secretary, John Simon, denied them. The march would go ahead. And so, with the official channel being a no-go, the people of the East End decided on a much more direct course of action. The call was put out via word of mouth and a hasty but large-scale poster campaign, calling on all to assemble on the 4th of October to bar the way for the rally. No one could know yet just how effective this would be, but as the time drew nearer, the hopes of the community grew ever stronger. The Battle of Cable Street. At approximately 1400, the members of the BUF began to gather at Tower Hill and ready themselves for their upcoming march, complete with flags, placards and banners. Even at this early stage of the day, tensions were high as small scuffles broke out on the fringes of the crowd. Each side even set up their own temporary dressing station for the injured. In a move very much out of the establishment's playbook, the Metropolitan Police Force had assembled around 7,000 constables, including horse-mounted officers, to clear the way ahead for the 3,000 to 5,000 strong BUF march to take place unimpeded. However, it became quickly apparent that this would be easier said than done. The streets of the East End had become thronged with tens of thousands of ordinary people from all walks of life, whether employed or on the dole, Christians, Jews, young and old, men and women, estimated to be in the region of 100,000, but could easily have been as high as 310,000. They all descended on the proposed route of the march and began to congregate. They began to build barricades across the street and held placards aloft denouncing the BUF and singing songs of solidarity, linking arms and chanting the Spanish phrase "No pasarán," or "They shall not pass." The largest concentration of people and fighting occurred around the areas of Aldgate, Whitechapel Road and Commercial Road. All these broad thoroughfares were very difficult to barricade effectively, but they were helped by tram drivers who, in solidarity, abandoned their vehicles, allowing the crowd to make use of them as a block, the drivers then joining the protests. The police had gone in with a very heavy hand, attempting to break up the crowd. The mounted policemen charged the mass of people, using the weight and momentum of their animals to shove people aside and encouraging them to rear up and flail their hooves. The coppers on foot followed close behind with truncheons drawn, striking left and right and dragging people away. But the sheer weight of numbers proved highly difficult to manage, and as violence begat more violence, the police were quickly overwhelmed, outnumbered, and in some cases surrounded. Meanwhile, in Cable Street, the whole road was packed virtually end to end with people. All the side streets had been heavily barricaded and were manned with the fittest and strongest of the group to halt any chance of the police breaking through. There was a lot of vicious fighting and struggles in the Cable Street area, and the police trying multiple times to take and dismantle the barricades, but time and again they were beaten back by the protesters. Even women in the upper floors of houses and buildings that overlooked the obstacles threw missiles down at the police and even emptied chamber pots over them. In the days before riot gear, this was a very dangerous day to be a London bobby. Back at Tower Hill at around 15:30, Oswald Mosley had arrived in the back of a drop-top car and was about to order the march to begin, but then the police, greatly fearing that even more violence would break out than had already been seen, Mosley and his black shirts were therefore ordered to leave the area, but they were permitted to march in the West End instead. Mosley, no doubt seething, reluctantly ordered the procession to make for Hyde Park and assemble for their rally there. The protesters had won. They had successfully defended their community, and the BUF was forced to slink away. Aftermath. The sheer weight of opposing numbers against them forced the issue for the BUF. They reluctantly slunk home to lick their wounds. Although the majority of the violence had actually been between protesters and the police rather than the BUF themselves, the crowd were sturdy in their resolve and were determined to bar the way. Around 150 people were arrested, the majority of them being anti-fascist protesters. There were also around 175 public and police seriously injured. Upon news of their victory, the counter-protesters erupted in rapturous celebrations. Cheers, singing, and tears of relief and happiness were shared for hours on end. For just one day, the whole of the East End had come together, put all of their other divisive issues aside, and stood firm against a very real threat to their community and the country in general. Only 3 years later, they would be proven right, as fascism in the form of Hitler's Nazi Party would plunge the world into a war even bloodier than the previous and would see a more atrocious death toll. The British government would take action to prevent another such occurrence by introducing the Public Order Act of 1936, banning political uniforms and quasi-military organisations. All protests and demonstrations were further required to request permission from the police before they were allowed to go ahead. Mosley, despite the obvious defeat, claimed victory by telling his followers that they had been denied their lawful right to expression of free speech by a mob of hooligans. The following year, in 1937, saw continued mounting opposition to the BUF, and even resulted in Mosley being knocked unconscious during an 8,000-strong rally in Liverpool, when, as he stood on the back of a truck to give the fascist salute, someone threw a rock at him, striking him in the head. One man, the former deputy of the BUF, Irish-American-born William Joyce, would flee to Nazi Germany, and during the war helped broadcast pro-Nazi propaganda over the airwaves under the sobriquet of Lord Haw-Haw. His broadcast, despite being anti-British, would be tuned into by large swathes of the British public who wanted to listen what their enemy was saying about them. His famous opening line of Germany calling, became his catchphrase. After the war, Joyce was captured and controversially executed for treason, despite not being British and therefore, by the strictest definition, could not commit treason. Of course, in the run-up to the war, Mosley became very close friends with Adolf Hitler, and the Führer even being the guest of honour at Mosley's wedding to his second wife, Diane Mitford, held in the house of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels only 2 days after the Battle of Cable Street, with Hitler gifting a signed portrait of himself as a wedding present that the couple would later place beside the crib of their first child, Max, as he slept. Classy. Legacy. The Battle of Cable Street represents one of the greatest moments of people power unilaterally coming together to stand up against the establishment. And fascism really was an establishment trait. The royal family at the time under King Edward VIII were known for making many home movies. In one of them, shot in 1933, His Majesty and Wallis Simpson can be seen encouraging his nieces, the young princesses Margaret and Elizabeth, yes, that Elizabeth, to perform the fascist salute. After his abdication, Edward VIII, now simply the Duke of Windsor, would become very close friends with Adolf Hitler, with controversial photographs existing of the former monarch inspecting SS troops. Plans were afoot to restore Edward to the throne and install Mosley as Prime Minister should the projected invasion of Britain succeed. Whilst it is hard to say exactly how bad a Mosley-led Britain would have been, if Hitler was the one pulling the strings, I feel safe in saying that it does not bear thinking about.
And in case you're wondering, no, there is no evidence to suggest that Mosley was ever involved with a certain Birmingham-based street gang.
To have assembled over 100,000 people in the days before social media is no mean achievement. Anyone who has ever tried to organise a simple night out over a group chat will know that trying to arrange such simple things is like trying to herd cats. So for the people of the mid-30s London to have simply dropped everything and come together in solidarity for their fellow man is truly a mammoth achievement. Let us not forget that they were fighting actual fascists, not just someone who disagrees with you online. The British Security Service, MI5, and the Special Branch had taken a keen interest in the BUF and had planted moles in the organisation to keep a close eye on them and their activities. In May of 1940, only 2 weeks after Winston Churchill had become Prime Minister, Mosley was detained and heavily questioned, but not charged with any crime. He and many other identified members of the BUF were interned, living with his wife and newborn son Max in a house in the grounds of HMP Holloway. The family were released in November of 1943 and kept under house arrest until the end of the war. The BUF would become a proscribed banned organisation, making it illegal to be a member. Mosley would claim in interviews many years later that he was never anti-Semitic and only disliked a certain number of people who just happened to be Jewish, but I can't help feel that this was more of a PR stunt to attempt to rescue his tattered reputation. In any case, the Second World War made certain that Mosley had no place in politics from that point on. To me, Mosley represents something of a strange case. He did not begin his political career with the warning signs of what was to come. Then, slowly but surely, it would appear that he either felt compelled to move to the more extreme fringe out of frustration with the establishment who refused to listen to him, or he was simply waiting for the right time to reveal his true colours. Perhaps Harvey Dent was right. You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Sir Oswald Mosley died on the 3rd of September 1980, at the age of 84. Forever remembered, whether rightly or wrongly, as Hitler's man in Britain. And yet, those of you familiar with Formula One racing actually have Oswald Mosley to thank in a weird way, as it would be his son Max, born in 1940, that would take the sport to a whole new level, to the heights of fame that we know today. However, the apple clearly doesn't fall far from the tree, as Max Mosley was involved in a scandal published by the News of the World newspaper involving Nazi-themed S&M orgies, although Max would then win a lawsuit against the publication for invasion of privacy. He would further go on to denounce the likes of Google for continuing to allow searches to bring up the pictures of his sexy parties. The Battle of Cable Street was immortalised in a mural painted in 1983 that still adorns the end of number 236 Cable Street, and the event is featured in the Terry Pratchett novel Night Watch. It also forms the topic of several songs, one in 1986 by the folk punk band The Men They Couldn't Hang, and another by the folk trio The Young'uns, which I heard for the first time only a few days ago, and it was that song that inspired me to make this video. I shall leave a link to their song in the description. Thank you for watching this video. I do hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, why not give it a like and help it reach a wider audience? It literally takes just a second. What did you think of Oswald Mosley and his mob? Let me know in the comments below. A huge thank you to everyone who gave such a huge outpouring of love and appreciation for the last video, being the 1 year anniversary and 40,000 sub special. You've no idea how humbling it is to read all of your lovely messages of support. If you wish to do so, you can support DID on Patreon, link in the description, or via the Super Thanks button. Or head on over to my Teespring store and grab yourself some swag and let everyone know you're one of the Dark Legion. A huge thank you to all of my current patrons. I really appreciate the support you give me. And if you crave more, head on over to my alternate channel DID Reads. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.